Welcome, everyone. Today, we are undertaking a really comprehensive explainer. Honestly, think of this as a true masterclass designed specifically for you CSS aspirants out there. I'm going to be putting on a few different hats today, a former FPSC examiner, a development economist, and a policy analyst to completely dissect Pakistan's economy. We're going to move from a baseline diagnosis right through to a high-level analytical synthesis using strictly peer-reviewed data. So, let's dive right in.
Here's a quick look at our syllabus. We're covering macroeconomics and human capital, energy and infrastructure, climate change and agriculture, poverty and social inclusion, fiscal policy, and we'll wrap up with exactly how to link all these concepts together for your CSS exams.
All right, Module 1, Macroeconomics and Human Capital.
Okay, before we even touch on economic growth or development, we absolutely need an objective diagnosis of Pakistan's demographic reality. And it all starts with this critical number. According to the 2023 census, Pakistan's population is sitting at a massive 241.49 million, growing at an annual rate of 2.55%. The fertility rate is 3.41, which, is considerably higher than regional neighbors like India and Bangladesh. Now, the absolutely crucial takeaway here for your Pakistan Affairs paper is the resulting demographic youth bulge. Nearly two-thirds of the entire nation is under 30 years old. And this youth population is actually growing faster than the national average. So this right here is the very foundation of our economic reality, an immense, rapidly growing workforce that is just entering adulthood. But we have to ask, what kind of economy are they actually entering? Well, while the macroeconomic outlook shows a GDP hitting $452.1 billion and a slight rise in per capita income to about $1,901, there is a massive, massive deficit in actual living standards. Pakistan ranks 168th out of 193 countries on the Human Development Index. The World Bank quite literally calls this a silent, deep human capital crisis. A shocking 40% of children under 5 are stunted due to malnutrition. So the key takeaway is that while we might see some modest macro growth in dollar terms, there is a severe deterioration happening in human development. Real economic progress is intrinsically linked to investing in human capital, and right now, sadly, that investment is largely missing.
And that brings us directly to the education emergency. Pakistan currently has over 26 million children out of school. That is the second highest number in the entire world. We are looking at a 40% illiteracy rate. Yet, despite this glaring crisis, government spending on education has plummeted to a new low of just 0.8% of GDP. Now, if you are writing a CSS essay on the demographic dividend, you absolutely must argue that a youth bulge without education and skills is not a dividend at all, it's a demographic disaster. An uneducated and unemployed youth creates immense, deep-rooted structural vulnerabilities for the state moving forward.
Moving on to Module 2, Energy Crises and Infrastructure.
So these human capital deficits we just talked about, they are compounded by structural bottlenecks that actively drag the entire economy down, totally preventing that transition from mere economic stabilization to actual meaningful development. This perfectly illustrates the paradox of Pakistan's energy sector. We have immense theoretical potential, right? Thar coal entering the national grid, plus vast untapped opportunities for wind and solar renewables. But the reality on the ground is grim. 8 to 18 hours of forced load shedding in various areas, chronic financial losses, underinvestment, and a crippling, seemingly endless circular debt. The source data points out that this is born directly from disintegrated energy planning. We have overlapping governance failures where institutions just don't coordinate, and that leads to a heavy reliance on imported fuels and a tariff structure that totally fails to reflect the true cost of supply.
To try and combat these huge infrastructure bottlenecks, the state relies really heavily on mega projects, most notably the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. The literature projects that CPEC interventions, things like the Gwadar Port development and special economic zones like the Alam-e-Kabul Industrial Zone in Faisalabad, are aimed at generating roughly 3 million new jobs and boosting overall economic growth by about 3 to 3.6% by the year 2030. Now, when discussing solutions in your exams, you have to analyze these projects objectively. They absolutely offer tremendous capacity for modernization, but their success hinges entirely on resolving the governance and energy gridlocks we were just discussing.
Module 3, Climate Change and Agriculture.
This is such a highly relevant theme for your current affairs and economic geography papers. Pakistan is an incredibly climate-sensitive nation. We actually rank 7th on the Global Climate Risk Index. It's fascinating and terrifying to see how physical climate changes, like rising temperatures and shifting precipitation patterns, feed directly into biophysical crop models, which then cause massive shocks to global economic models. Climate change isn't just an environmental issue anymore, folks. It is a core economic threat. Changes in the monsoon, floods, and droughts don't just lower crop yields, they cause this massive cascading multiplier effect across prices, income, production, consumption, and even international trade.
Let's anchor this with some hard data that you can definitely use in your essays. Using extreme emission scenarios projected for the year 2050, the models predict a 14.5% reduction in wheat output and a 20.5% reduction in rice output for Pakistan. So what does that actually mean economically? It translates to a staggering $19.5 billion loss to Pakistan's real GDP. That's a 3.7% contraction. It means lower exports, higher imports just to ensure basic food security, and a massive spike in commodity prices that is going to severely hit urban households. Seriously, memorize these statistics. FPSC examiners look for exactly this kind of data-driven anchoring when you're discussing climate vulnerability.
All right, Module 4, Poverty and Social Inclusion.
Now, let's pivot from those macro global models all the way down to the micro level. With extreme poverty rising to 16.5%, how does the state actually manage social inclusion and protect its most vulnerable citizens? Well, we look to the Benazir Income Support Program, or BISP, as a vital case study here. BISP leverages mobile banking for government-to-person payments, specifically targeting women. The process is really fascinating. First, there's mandatory NADRA registration, which actually gave many of these women their very first identity cards. Second is biometric verification. Third, digital cash disbursement directly through agents, which bypasses and eliminates corrupt middlemen. And fourth, the ultimate goal, social empowerment. Women who traditionally observed strict PERDA stepped out to get their CNICs and interact with financial institutions, many for the very first time in their lives.
However, as future bureaucrats and analysts, we must apply critical analysis. Consider this perspective from an Easy Paisa manager regarding the rollout. They said, the design of M-banking is not female or gender-friendly. Women users are crippled by technology. This is such a profound point. While the intervention was undoubtedly socially transformative and politically empowering, literally giving women newfound financial autonomy, it was simultaneously technologically constraining. The systems just weren't designed for users with low literacy. This duality is exactly the kind of nuanced, multidimensional analysis you need when you're writing about women's empowerment and state interventions.
Module 5, Fiscal Policy and Vulnerabilities.
So, considering all of this, how is the government trying to finance its way out of these crises? Recent fiscal budgets show a real attempt to transition away from IMF-driven stabilization and pivot toward growth. The policy vectors here include things like a reduction in the supertax, which directly benefits around 216 non-financial listed firms, essentially boosting corporate profitability. Furthermore, the state heavily favors the real estate sector, reducing withholding taxes on property to stimulate construction. But here is the analytical catch you have got to highlight. Construction-led growth in Pakistan is heavily import-dependent. Cement requires imported coal, steel requires imported scrap. So by stimulating growth in these specific sectors, we actually risk severely widening the external current account deficit.
And that external deficit leads us right to the brink of debt distress. You have to remember, Pakistan doesn't operate in a vacuum. Currently, global interest rates are so much higher than they were during the COVID-19 era, hovering around 3%, which makes commercial borrowing incredibly expensive. Furthermore, Pakistan suffers from what analysts call the Sri Lanka spillover effect. Basically, even if our core economic fundamentals differ, international rating agencies and lenders often just lump high-debt regional countries together. A general perception of poor economic management in the region directly increases the risk premium that Pakistan has to pay just to borrow internationally.
Finally, Module 6, CSS Exam, Analytical Linkages.
Okay, let's put my former FPSC examiner hat firmly on. How do you fuse all this information into a high-scoring CSS essay or Pakistan Affairs answer? It's simple. You have to map the data across your syllabus topics. When a question asks about democracy or governance, please don't just give a historical timeline. Use the 241 million population stat and that massive youth bulge to discuss the immense pressure on democratic institutions to deliver jobs. If a question is on national security, use that $19.5 billion climate-induced loss to argue that non-traditional security threats, like food and water scarcity, are actually our biggest dangers right now. If the essay is on the SDGs or women's empowerment, bring in the BISP mobile banking case study to perfectly show the intersection of technology, gender, and social inclusion.
Remember, high-scoring candidates always use analytical frameworks. First up, data anchoring. Vagueness is the absolute enemy of a good CSS paper. Don't just say, climate change is bad for the economy. Say, climate change threatens a $19.5 billion contraction in real GDP by 2050. See the difference? Second, maintain objective neutrality. When you're discussing the energy crisis or fiscal policy, strictly avoid partisan rhetoric. Use academic terms like disintegrated planning, structural bottlenecks, and misallocation of resources. Third, link the micro to the macro. Show the examiner how one single woman receiving digital cash in rural Sindh directly impacts our national metrics for human development.
Ultimately, top-tier policy analysis requires you to see the entire board at once. It's like a global, computable general equilibrium model. Everything is connected. Households, the government, banks, firms, and the rest of the world. Think about it. A shock in agriculture caused by climate change alters firm production, right? That then alters household income, which affects government tax revenues, which then severely limits social spending for programs like BISP, which ultimately exacerbates the human capital crisis. Grasping the circular flow is exactly the level of analysis expected of a future top-tier bureaucrat.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought today, which honestly is a perfect prompt for your very next practice essay. Considering all the deep structural bottlenecks in energy, education, and climate vulnerability we've explored today, can localized micro-interventions ever truly offset our macroeconomic debt distress, or is holistic political reform the only viable prerequisite for sustainable growth? I want you to really chew on that, structure your arguments using the exact data we covered today, and keep analyzing. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. Keep studying hard, and I'll see you in the next one.